Elizabeth Carter ripped the signed contract in half, held both pieces up so the entire boardroom could see, and let them fall to the floor like dead leaves. "That," she said quietly, "is what I think of your final offer." 12 of the most powerful men in America sat frozen. Nobody breathed. Nobody dared. She was 34 years old, worth more than every man in that room combined, and she had never lost a single negotiation in her life. But 3 weeks later, a broke auto mechanic in oil-stained coveralls would look her dead in the eye and tell her no, and Elizabeth Carter would have no idea what to do, because the woman who could break billion-dollar men with a whisper was about to be undone by a man who owned almost nothing at all. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far this story travels. And if you believe a good man's word is worth more than a rich man's money, do me a favor and subscribe, because this is a story about exactly that. Now let's begin. The 43rd floor of the Carter Global Tower belonged to one person, and everyone who worked there knew it. Elizabeth Carter walked out of that boardroom without looking back at the men she'd just humiliated. Her assistant Marcus fell into step beside her, tablet in hand, already flinching before she'd said a word. "Reschedule the Hoffman Group for Thursday," she said, "and tell them if they send me another lowball offer, I'll buy their supplier out from under them and let them watch it burn." "Yes, Ms. Carter." "And the press release on the acquisition. Who approved that headline?" "That was, I believe, Jennifer in communications." "Jennifer is no longer in communications." Elizabeth didn't raise her voice. She never had to. "Have someone clean out her desk before lunch." Marcus swallowed. "Ms. Carter, Jennifer has been with the company for—" Elizabeth stopped walking. The whole hallway seemed to stop with her. She turned and looked at her assistant with those cold gray eyes that had made grown executives lose their train of thought mid-sentence. "Did I ask you how long she's been here?" "No, ma'am." "Then why are you telling me—" Marcus looked down at his shoes. "I'll take care of it." "Good." She kept walking. This was the woman the world knew. Iron Elizabeth, the business magazines called her. The youngest woman to ever take a company from a garage startup to a $14 billion empire. She had built Carter Global from nothing, from a 2-room office and a maxed-out credit card, and a belief drilled into her since childhood that the only person you could ever truly rely on was yourself. She had proof of that belief. Bitter, expensive proof. The people who admired her from a distance thought she was born this way, cold, sharp, untouchable. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that once, a long time ago, Elizabeth Carter had been soft. Once she had laughed easily. Once she had loved a man named Adrian Wells with the reckless, wide-open heart of someone who had never been taught that hearts could be used against you. Adrian had been charming. Adrian had been beautiful. And when Carter Global hit its first real crisis, 6 weeks of hell, when a supplier collapsed and the bank circled and every headline predicted her ruin, Adrian had done exactly what he'd been planning to do all along. He drained the joint account they'd opened as a symbol of trust. He sold the story of her company's struggles to a rival firm. And on the worst night of her life, when she came home shaking, needing someone, needing anyone, she found a note on the kitchen counter. "You were a good investment while it lasted." 6 words. That was all she'd been worth to him. 6 words. Elizabeth had read that note exactly once. Then she'd folded it into a small square, put it in a drawer, and made herself a promise that she had kept for 8 straight years. Never again. She saved the company alone. She rebuilt it alone. She grew it into an empire alone. And somewhere in those years of 18-hour days and ruthless decisions, the soft woman who had loved Adrian Wells quietly died, and Iron Elizabeth took her place. A woman who understood that love was just a story people told to get their hands on things that didn't belong to them. That was who stepped into the private elevator that evening, briefcase in hand, ready to go home to a penthouse where no one waited for her. That was who the storm was about to change. It was raining when Elizabeth's driver Thomas pulled the car out of the underground garage, one of those brutal October storms that turns city streets into rivers and makes taillights bleed across wet glass. "Roads are bad tonight, Miss Carter," Thomas said. "There's flooding on the parkway. I'll take Riverside instead." Fine. She wasn't listening. She was on her phone answering emails, doing what she always did, which was work, until the day surrendered. She didn't look up when the car turned onto Riverside. She didn't look up when the rain got harder. She only looked up when the engine made a sound she'd never heard a luxury sedan make, a wet, grinding cough, and then died completely right there on a dark road with water rising over the curbs. Thomas turned the key. Nothing. Again. Nothing. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter, I don't understand. It was serviced last week." "Call another car." He tried. His phone showed one bar, then none. The storm had knocked out something. "There's no signal. Ms. Carter, I really apologize. Where are we?" Thomas peered through the rain. "There's a garage, right there. Lights are on. Maybe they can help." Elizabeth looked at the low brick building across the street. A hand-painted sign hung over the door. Brooks Auto Repair. A single yellow bulb burned over the entrance, and through the open bay door, she could see a man bent over in engine sleeves, rolled up, working late in the rain, like he had nowhere better to be. Any other night, she would have waited in the car. Elizabeth Carter did not walk into greasy roadside garages. She had people for that. She had entire departments for that. But her phone was dying, her driver was useless, and the water was climbing. So she did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She got out of the car herself, held her $1,000 coat over her head, and walked across the flooded street toward the light. The man didn't hear her come in. The rain drowned out her heels on the concrete, and he was fully lost in his work, humming something under his breath, one hand deep in the guts of an old pickup truck. "Excuse me." He straightened up, turned around, and Elizabeth got her first real look at Daniel Brooks. He was maybe 40. Dark hair, a couple of days of stubble, a face that had been rained on and worked hard and gone without sleep more nights than it should have. His coveralls were streaked with grease, and his hands were black to the wrist. But his eyes, she noticed his eyes, and she didn't know why. They were steady, warm. The eyes of a man who had been through something heavy, and come out the other side without turning mean about it. "Evening," he said. "You look a little lost. My car broke down, across the street. The engine just stopped." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag that was somehow dirtier than his hands, and came around the truck. "In this weather? Yeah, that'll happen. Water gets somewhere it shouldn't. You want me to take a look?" "Yes, and I'd like it fixed quickly. I'll pay whatever it costs." Something flickered across his face. Not offense exactly. Amusement, maybe. "Well, let's see what's wrong with it first before we start talking about my retirement fund." He grabbed a heavy raincoat off a hook, threw it on, and grabbed a flashlight and a toolbox. He was already halfway to the door when he glanced back at her. "You coming, or you gonna wait here where it's dry?" Elizabeth blinked. Men did not talk to her like that. Men opened doors for her, or feared her, or wanted something from her. This one was walking out into the rain and simply expecting her to keep up. "I'll wait here," she said. "Suit yourself." He was gone for 20 minutes. When he came back, he was soaked through, and Elizabeth's driver, Thomas, was behind him, looking sheepish and relieved. "All right," Daniel said, peeling off the wet coat. "Bad news is your fuel line took on water, and your electrical's shot. That's not a tonight fix. Good news is, I can tow it into the bay and have it running by tomorrow afternoon." "Tomorrow afternoon is unacceptable." "Okay." He said it without a trace of the panic she was used to seeing when she used that tone. He just shrugged and started putting his tools away. "Then it's unacceptable. Doesn't change the car." Elizabeth stared at him. Thomas held his breath. "Do you know who I am?" she said. Daniel looked at her, really looked up and down the coat, the shoes, the diamond at her throat that cost more than the entire building they were standing in. "Somebody with a very expensive car and a very bad night," he said. "That about right." And for a reason she couldn't name, Elizabeth Carter, who had a reply for everything, had nothing to say to that. He made her coffee. She hadn't asked for it. He just poured it into a chipped mug that said, "World's okayest dad," and set it on the counter in front of her without ceremony. "It's not the good stuff you're used to," he said, "but it's hot and you look cold." She looked at the mug. She looked at him. "World's okayest," she read. "My daughter got me that." He almost smiled. "She thinks she's funny. She's 6. Everything's funny when you're 6. You have a daughter. Emma, she's asleep in the back. I keep a little cot in the office for the late nights. Her babysitter had a family thing tonight, so—" He shrugged, like it was nothing. Like a man raising a child alone in the back room of a repair shop was the most ordinary thing in the world. Elizabeth found herself asking a question she never asked strangers. And her mother, the warmth in his eyes dimmed just slightly. He picked up a wrench, set it down again. "It's just me and Emma," he said. "Has been for a while now." He didn't explain, and Elizabeth didn't push. But something passed between them in that moment, a recognition maybe. Two people who had each lost something and learned to build their whole lives around the hole it left behind. "You're going to have to stay somewhere tonight," Daniel said, changing the subject. "There's a decent hotel about 6 blocks up. Your driver can walk you there once the rain lets up." "I'll send a car." "Sure, if your phone works." He nodded at the dead phone in her hand. It didn't work. She'd checked 4 times. Elizabeth looked out at the storm at her dead car at the flooded street, and for the first time in 8 years, Iron Elizabeth was entirely stuck with no assistant. No driver's worth of help, no department to call, no leverage. Just her, a broken car, and a mechanic in a garage who didn't seem impressed by a single thing about her. "Do you always work this late?" she asked, mostly to fill the silence. "When the work's there." He went back to the pickup truck he'd been on when she arrived. "This one belongs to a man named Earl. 71 years old, drives at 40 miles to see his wife in a care facility every day. His transmission's shot and he can't afford a new one, so I'm rebuilding it a piece at a time when I've got the hours." "Is he paying you, bum, $20 a week? When he's got it?" Elizabeth frowned. "That's not sustainable. You'll lose money on the parts alone." "Probably. Then why do it?" Daniel looked up at her, and there was something in his face she couldn't quite read. "Because his wife's got about 4 months left, and 40 miles a day is the only thing keeping that man alive. That's why." Elizabeth had built an empire on the principle that every decision was a transaction, that sentiment was a liability, that the smart move was always the one that protected you. And here was this man, soaked to the bone at 9 o'clock at night, deliberately losing money to keep a stranger's grief on the road a little longer. She didn't understand it, and she couldn't stop thinking about it. Jared. The rain didn't let up. By 10:30, it was clear no car was coming. No hotel walk was happening, and the water outside had risen high enough that the street looked more like a canal. Daniel had checked on his daughter twice, tucking the blanket up around her small shoulders each time with a gentleness that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Not the same man who'd told a billionaire no without blinking. "You can't walk out in that," he finally said. "Not in those shoes, not tonight." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, it's not the Ritz, but there's a couch in the office and a space heater. You and your driver can wait it out, and first thing in the morning I'll get you sorted." Elizabeth had slept in 5-star hotels on 4 continents. She had a penthouse with a view of the entire city. And she was being offered a couch in the back office of an auto shop by a man who owned a chipped coffee mug and a 6-year-old's cot. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Daniel paused. "Doing what? Helping me? You don't know me. You could put me out in the rain and you'd never see me again." He looked at her like the question genuinely confused him. "Because you're a person who needs help and I'm a person who can give it. What other reason would I need?" "What other reason would I need?" Elizabeth Carter had spent 8 years assuming that everyone always had another reason. That was the whole architecture of her life, the certainty that behind every kind word was a hand reaching for her wallet. She'd built a $14 billion company on the wreckage of that certainty. And in 5 seconds in a leaking garage, a mechanic had said a sentence that made no sense inside it. She followed him to the office. It was small and cluttered, But it was clean in the way that told her he tried, that a man who had almost nothing still took care of what little he had. There were drawings taped to the wall, crayon sons and stick figure families all signed Emma in careful, oversized letters. In several of them, there were only two figures, a big one and a small one. Never a third. Elizabeth looked at those drawings for a long time. She draws every day, Daniel said quietly, noticing where her eyes had gone. I keep every one. Someday I'll show her the whole stack and she'll be mortified. He almost smiled again. That's my retirement plan, honestly. Embarrassing her at her wedding. You love her very much. She's the reason for all of it, he said simply. Everything I do it for her. The late nights, the $20 transmissions, all of it. As long as she goes to bed knowing somebody in this world would burn the whole thing down for her, I figure I'm doing my job. Elizabeth thought about her own father. About Richard Carter, who had raised her on the philosophy that weakness was a disease and love was leverage. She thought about the childhood dinners where she'd learned to present her feelings the way you'd present a quarterly report, cleanly defensively, with nothing soft left exposed. And she thought nobody ever loved me like this man loves his daughter. The thought arrived out of nowhere, and it hurt so much she nearly gasped. You should get some rest, Daniel said, oblivious. I'll be out in the bay. Earl's transmission won't rebuild itself. He handed her a folded blanket that smelled like fabric softener and faintly like a home. Yell if you need anything. He left, and Elizabeth Carter sat on a worn couch in the back of a garage holding a stranger's blanket and felt something crack in a wall she'd spent 8 years building. She didn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the rain and the distant clink of tools, and around 1 a.m. she heard a small voice. Daddy? Elizabeth sat up. The little girl Emma was standing in the doorway of the office in mismatched pajamas, rubbing her eyes, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had clearly been loved half to pieces. Oh, Emma said, seeing her. You're not my daddy. No, Elizabeth said. She had no idea how to talk to a child. She'd never had a reason to learn. I'm not. Your father's fixing a car. He'll be right back. Emma studied her with the frank, fearless curiosity that only small children have. You're pretty, she announced. Are you a princess? No. You look like one. You have shiny shoes. Emma padded closer, and without any hesitation at all climbed up onto the couch beside her, tucking the rabbit under her chin. I couldn't sleep. I had a dream about the ocean, but the ocean was made of soup, and that's not a good dream. Elizabeth, against every instinct she had, felt her mouth twitch. No, that doesn't sound good. Do you have kids? No. A husband? No. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a small judge. That's okay, she decided. You can borrow my daddy sometimes. He's really good at bad dreams. He does a thing where he checks under the bed for monsters, and if there's a monster, he tells it to leave, and it always listens. Something enormous and long buried turned over in Elizabeth's chest. Does it? She managed. Every time. Emma yawned hugely. He's the strongest daddy. He can lift a whole engine, and he makes pancakes on Sundays even when he's tired. Her eyes were drifting closed. He says we don't have a lot, but we have enough. What's enough mean? Elizabeth looked down at this small, warm, trusting child who had wandered into her life at 1 a.m. and asked her a question that her $14 billion could not answer. I don't know, Elizabeth said honestly. I've been trying to figure that out my whole life. But Emma was already asleep, her head coming to rest against Elizabeth's arm, the stuffed rabbit sliding into her lap. And Elizabeth Carter, the woman who fired people for saying too many words, who tore contracts in half to make a point, who had not been touched with simple expectation-free affection. In longer than she could remember, sat perfectly still, terrified to move, while a 6-year-old slept against her, like it was the most natural thing in the world. That was how Daniel found them 20 minutes later when he came to check on his daughter. He stopped in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at Emma, curled trustingly against this stranger, at the stranger sitting rigid and wide-eyed and utterly overwhelmed, holding a stuffed rabbit like it might explode. "She does that," Daniel said softly. "Adopts people. Sorry." "Don't be." The words came out of Elizabeth quieter than she'd intended. Don't wake her." Daniel came in slowly and knelt down, and with those same grease-stained hands that had refused her money, he gently lifted his daughter, careful not to jostle her, murmuring something too soft to hear. Emma stirred, wrapped her arms around his neck out of pure instinct, and went back to sleep against his shoulder. "Enough," Elizabeth said suddenly. Daniel looked at her. "What?" She asked me what enough means. "You tell her you don't have a lot, but you have enough." Elizabeth's voice was strange in her own ears, raw, unguarded, a voice she hadn't used in years. "I run a company worth $14 billion, Mr. Brooks. I have 3 homes. I've never once had enough of anything in my life. Not once. And she's sleeping soup dreams away in a garage, and she thinks she has enough." She stopped, embarrassed by how much had come out. "How do you do that? How do you give a child that?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, holding his sleeping daughter, watching this powerful, hollowed-out woman fall apart in slow motion on his couch. "You want the truth," he said. "It's not the money. It was never the money. I could give her everything in the world, and she'd still need the one thing that doesn't have a price. She needs to know somebody's there. That when the lights go out, somebody's between her and the dark. That's all enough is." He shifted Emma's weight. "You don't build that. You just show up, every day, even when you're tired, especially when you're tired." He turned to carry Emma back to her cot, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think you never had enough because you couldn't afford it. I think somebody taught you a long time ago that reaching for it would get your hand slapped. So you stopped reaching." He gave a small, tired shrug. "But that's just a guess. I fix cars. What do I know?" And he left, carrying his daughter, leaving Elizabeth Carter alone, with a truth that had just walked past all 14 billion of her dollars and put its finger on the exact center of the wound she'd been hiding from the whole world for 8 years. She did not sleep at all that night. Morning came gray and washed out the storm finally spent. Elizabeth woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of a small voice singing tunelessly somewhere nearby. She sat up. Her $1,000 suit was wrinkled. Her hair was a disaster. She had a crick in her neck from the couch and mascara she hadn't been able to remove. She was certain, nothing like the woman on the covers of business magazines. She'd never felt less like a CEO, and strangely, unsettlingly more like a person. Emma appeared in the doorway again, now dressed in a dinosaur t-shirt, her hair in a lopsided ponytail that could only have been done by a father doing his best. "Daddy made pancakes," she announced. "It's not even Sunday. He said you're a guest and guests get pancakes. Do you want pancakes? They're kind of burnt, but only on one side." Elizabeth Carter had turned down invitations from presidents. She had skipped state dinners because they bored her. "Yes," she said. "I'd love a pancake." Emma beamed like she'd won something and grabbed Elizabeth's hand. Just grabbed it without asking, the way children do, and towed her out into the garage where a folding table had been set up between the toolboxes and where Daniel Brooks stood at a hot plate, flipping pancakes with the same steady focus he'd given the engine the night before. "Morning," he said, not looking up. "Fair warning, the pancakes are aggressive. Emma likes them shaped like animals, but I've only really mastered lump." "They're supposed to be turtles," Emma explained gravely, sitting down and swinging her legs. "But Daddy's turtles look like clouds." "Turtles are just clouds with legs," Daniel said. "It's a very sophisticated interpretation." Elizabeth sat down at the folding table in her ruined suit in the middle of a repair shop and ate a burnt, lopsided pancake, shaped like a cloud that was supposed to be a turtle off a plastic plate, next to a 6-year-old who kept up a running commentary about dinosaurs, and her friend Katie, who ate a crayon once. And it was without any competition whatsoever the best meal she'd had in years. Her phone buzzed to life somewhere in her bag. Signal restored, the world flooding back in 47 missed messages, Marcus in a panic, the empire wondering where its queen had gone. She heard it buzzing, and for 1 full minute she didn't answer it. That more than anything told her something was wrong. Or maybe for the first time in 8 years, something was right, and she just didn't have a word for it yet. "Your car should be ready by 2, Daniel said, sliding another pancake onto Emma's plate. "Fuel line's flushed. I ordered the electrical part first thing. It'll be here by noon." "Thank you." Elizabeth hesitated. "How much do I owe you?" "For the car, I'll write it up. Parts and labor fair price. I don't gouge." He finally looked at her. "For the couch and the pancakes, nothing. Guests don't pay." "You barely know me." "I know you didn't put a kid out in the rain," Daniel said. "I know you told a scared little girl her soup ocean dream was a bad dream instead of laughing at her. I know more about you than you think, Ms. Carter." He turned back to the hot plate. "People show you who they are in the small stuff, not the big stuff. Anybody can behave when it counts. It's the 2 in the morning, nobody's watching stuff that tells you who somebody actually is." Elizabeth looked at him. This man who had refused her money twice, who had given a stranger his couch and his pancakes and his daughter's trust, who saw her more clearly in 12 hours than her own father had seen her in 34 years. "You never told me," she said. "What happened to Emma's mother?" Daniel's shoulders tightened, just slightly. He flipped a pancake. When he spoke, his voice was even, but there was an old deep hurt underneath it, worn smooth by time like a stone in a river. "Emma was 2, he said. "Sarah got sick. It happened fast. 6 months start to finish." He set down the spatula. "We didn't have insurance worth anything. I sold everything that would sell. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough." He was quiet for a moment. "At the end, she made me promise 2 things. That I'd take care of Emma, and that I wouldn't let losing her turn me into somebody bitter." He looked down at his daughter, who was drawing a dinosaur on her napkin, oblivious. "I've kept the first promise. I work on the second one every day." Elizabeth sat very still. She had lost 2, not a wife but a self. The soft version of her, the one who reached for things, the one who trusted. Adrian had killed that woman as surely as sickness had taken Sarah. But where Daniel had made a promise not to let his loss make him bitter, Elizabeth had done the exact opposite. She had built an entire empire out of her bitterness. She had made it her armor, her weapon, her identity. And sitting in that garage watching a man who had lost more than she ever had and stayed gentle anyway, Elizabeth Carter felt for the first time ashamed of the woman she'd become. "That's a good promise," she said quietly. "To keep." "It's a hard one." Daniel gave her a look, steady, kind, and far too perceptive. "Bitterness is easy. It feels like strength. Everybody around you tells you it's strength." He shrugged. "It's not, though. It's just fear that got tired of waiting. Fear that got tired of waiting." Elizabeth thought about the boardroom, about the torn contract, about the 12 terrified men and the fired employees and the 8 years of being untouchable, and she wondered with a slow, sick lurch whether every ruthless thing she'd ever done had just been fear wearing a very expensive suit. Emma held up her napkin. "Daddy, is this a good dinosaur?" "That's the best dinosaur I've ever seen." "You say that every time." "Because it's true every time." Elizabeth watched them and felt her phone buzz again, insistent, the Empire calling her home. And she made a decision that she did not fully understand and could not have explained to a single soul in her world. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "when my car is ready this afternoon, I'd like to come back, not for the car." She surprised herself with the honesty. "I'd like to come back and see how Earl's transmission is coming along, if that would be all right." Daniel studied her for a long moment. And whatever he saw, it made something in his expression shift. Not softening exactly, but opening the smallest crack in a door. "Emma," he said, without looking away from Elizabeth. "The lady wants to know if she can come back and visit." Emma didn't even look up from her dinosaur. "She can come back," she said as if this were obvious. She's nice, she let me sleep on her, and she has shiny shoes. Daniel almost smiled. Well, he said, there you have it, the boss has spoken. He picked up the spatula again. The door's open, Ms. Carter. It usually is. She went back to her world that afternoon. Her car purred like new. Daniel had written up a bill so fair, it was almost insulting. She'd paid contractors 10 times as much for a tenth as much work, and he'd refused again to take $1 more than the paper said. She'd handed Emma a business card as a joke, telling her to call if she ever needed a job, and Emma had solemnly folded it into her pocket like it was treasure. By 4 o'clock, Elizabeth was back on the 43rd floor of the Carter Global Tower. Marcus was beside himself with relief. There were fires to put out a deal to close an empire that had held its breath for 18 hours waiting for her to return. She sat down at her enormous desk in her enormous office with the entire city spread out below her like a kingdom she owned. And she thought about a chipped mug that said, "World's okayest dad." She thought about a little girl who fell asleep against a stranger because she'd never learned to be afraid of the world. She thought about a man who told her no to her money, no to her power, no to every tool she'd spent her life sharpening, and who somehow made it feel less like a rejection and more like the first honest thing anyone had said to her in 8 years. Ms. Carter. Marcus was in the doorway. The Hoffman Group is on the line. They've come back groveling. They'll take the original terms. You broke them, ma'am. Whatever you want to do, they'll sign it. Elizabeth looked at the phone. She looked at the city. She looked at the reflection of the woman in the dark glass. The woman. The whole world feared the woman who had everything, and returned every night to an empty penthouse where no one waited, where no one checked under the bed for monsters, where no one had ever not once said, "You don't have a lot, but you have enough." Ms. Carter, Marcus asked again. What should I tell them? For a long moment, she didn't answer. She was thinking about a burnt pancake, shaped like a cloud, that was supposed to be a turtle. Tell them I'll call them tomorrow, she said finally. Marcus blinked. Elizabeth Carter did not make people wait. Elizabeth Carter closed the deal the second it was ready to close. That was who she was. That was who she'd always been. Ma'am, is everything all right? She looked at her assistant, really looked at him. This frightened young man who flinched every time she spoke, and she felt unexpectedly a small pang of something she didn't recognize as guilt because she hadn't felt it in so long. Marcus, she said. That woman in communications. Jennifer. Yes, ma'am. I had her desk cleaned out this morning like you. Call her back. Give her the job back. Elizabeth turned to the window. And a raise, whatever it takes. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, absolutely certain he had misheard. Ma'am? You heard me. Yes, ma'am. He hesitated. May I ask what changed your mind? Elizabeth Carter looked out over the city she owned, over the $14 billion and the empire and the whole gleaming kingdom she'd built out of fear that had gotten tired of waiting. And she thought of a man in a garage who would rebuild a dying woman's husband a transmission at a time for $20 a week, and who had looked at the most powerful woman in America and seen underneath all of it a person who'd forgotten how to reach for the one thing money couldn't buy. Somebody reminded me of something, she said quietly. That's all. She didn't explain further. She couldn't. Marcus wouldn't have understood, and she barely understood it herself. All she knew, all Iron Elizabeth knew, standing in her tower with the whole world at her feet, was that a broken-down car had led her to a leaking garage on the worst night of the storm, and she had walked in as one woman and walked out somehow as someone who might just remember how to be another. She picked up her phone. She scrolled to the bottom of her contacts past the presidents and the investors and the men who feared her, and she added one new name with 2 grease-stained hands and a chipped mug and a little girl who thought she was a princess. Daniel Brooks. Then she set the phone face down on the desk, turned back to the window, and watched the sun go down over her kingdom, and for the first time in 8 long years, Elizabeth Carter felt the smallest, most terrifying, most impossible thing begin to grow inside the ruins of the wall she'd built. Hope. And she had absolutely no idea what she was going to do with it. She came back on a Tuesday. Elizabeth told herself it was because she had a free hour between meetings, which was a lie so obvious that even Marcus, who knew better than to question her, had raised one eyebrow when she'd told him to cancel her lunch. Iron Elizabeth did not have free hours. Iron Elizabeth had scheduled every minute of every day for 8 years, and the idea that she would drive herself, she'd sent Thomas home. Another thing she never did across the city to a repair shop she had no business visiting was so far outside her pattern that she'd spent the entire drive arguing with herself about turning around. She didn't turn around. Emma saw her first. The little girl was sitting on an overturned crate near the bay door, drawing on a piece of cardboard with a stub of chalk, and the moment she looked up and recognized the car, she shot to her feet and started waving with both arms like she was flagging down a rescue plane. "Daddy, the princess came back. The princess is here." Elizabeth got out of the car, and before she could say a single word, Emma had crossed the lot and thrown both arms around her legs, chalk and all, leaving a white handprint on the side of a suit that cost more than Daniel made in 3 months. Elizabeth froze. She did not know what to do with a child attached to her legs. She looked down at the small head pressed against her knee, and very carefully, as if she might break something, she put one hand on Emma's hair. "Hello," she said. "You came back," Emma said, muffled into her leg. "I told Daddy you would. He said don't get your hopes up, but I got my hopes up anyway, and I was right." Daniel came out of the bay wiping his hands on the same permanently dirty rag, and there was something careful in his face when he saw her, not unfriendly, but guarded, the look of a man who'd learned not to expect people to do what they said they'd do. "Well," he said, "you actually came. I said I would. People say a lot of things." He nodded toward the handprint on her suit. "Sorry about that. Emma, what did we say about tackling people?" "You said don't tackle people," Emma recited, still holding on. "But she's not people, she's the princess, so it doesn't count." Elizabeth felt her mouth do something it hadn't done in years. It took her a second to recognize the sensation as a smile. "It's fine," she said. "The suit will survive." "That's a real expensive suit to be so relaxed about," Daniel said. "It's just a suit." He looked at her for a beat too long, like she'd said something surprising, and then he shrugged. "All right, well, Earl's transmission's over here if that's really what you came to see. Fair warning, it's a transmission. It's not a lot to look at." But that was the thing, she hadn't come to see the transmission, and they both knew it, and the fact that neither of them said so out loud was somehow the most honest exchange Elizabeth had had in a long time. She stayed 2 hours. She didn't mean to. She meant to look at the transmission, make some polite comment, and leave. Instead, Emma dragged her over to the crate to show her the cardboard drawing, which was apparently a portrait of Elizabeth herself, depicted as a stick figure with an enormous yellow triangle for a dress and 2 black dots for the shiny shoes. Elizabeth studied it with the seriousness she'd normally reserve for an acquisition contract. "This is me," she said. "That's you. See, that's your crown." "I don't have a crown." "You do in the drawing," Emma explained patiently, as if Elizabeth were being slow. "Because in the drawing you're a princess. In real life you're a, what did Daddy say you are?" "A CEO," Daniel said from under Earl's truck, not looking up. "A CEO," Emma repeated carefully. "What's that?" "It means she's the boss of a very big company," Daniel said. Emma absorbed this. "Bigger than the garage." "A little bigger." "Bigger than the whole garage." "Yeah, sweetheart, a little bigger than the whole garage." Emma turned back to Elizabeth with new respect. "Do you have a lot of wrenches?" And Elizabeth Carter, who had that morning approved a decision that would affect 4,000 employees across 3 continents, sat on an overturned crate and had a completely serious conversation with a 6-year-old about whether being the boss meant you got the biggest wrench, and she could not remember the last time an hour had passed so easily. When she finally left, Daniel walked her to her car. Emma had been sent inside to wash the chalk off her hands, and for a moment it was just the 2 of them in the fading afternoon. "She likes you," Daniel said. That doesn't happen much. She's careful with people. She lost her mom young enough that she doesn't really remember her, but old enough that some part of her knows to protect herself. He rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know what it is about you, but she picked you the first night, sound asleep on a stranger. She's never done that. Children are strange, Elizabeth said. They're the least strange people alive, Daniel said. They just haven't learned to lie yet. When a kid likes you, it's because there's something in you worth liking. They can't fake it, and they can't fool themselves into it. They just know. He opened her car door for her, which she noticed because no one opened doors for her anymore. They were all too afraid of doing it wrong. So, whatever you're hiding under all that armor, Ms. Carter, my daughter found it in about 4 minutes. Might want to consider that it's worth finding. He shut the door before she could answer, and Elizabeth drove back to her tower with a white chalk handprint on her suit that she did not for reasons she couldn't explain wipe off until she was alone in her penthouse that night. And even then, she'd stood in front of the mirror, looking at it for a long time before she finally let herself change. She came back the next week, and the week after that. It became a thing she did, though she never named it and never scheduled it, and always told herself each time that it was the last time. She'd tell Marcus to clear an afternoon, and she'd drive across the city, and she'd sit on the crate, and Emma would show her drawings, and Daniel would work and talk. And it was the only place in her entire life where nothing was expected of her, where no one wanted anything, where being Elizabeth Carter meant absolutely nothing except that she was a person who showed up. It was on the 4th visit that she made the mistake. Emma had mentioned in passing that the garage's roof leaked over the office, and that when it rained, her drawings on the wall got wet and curled up. She'd said it the way children say things, without any weight, just reporting the news of the world. But Elizabeth had heard it, and Elizabeth had spent 34 years being a person who fixed problems, and so the next morning she'd made 2 phone calls, and by the following week, a contractor had arrived at Brooks Auto Repair to replace the roof. Daniel called her that evening. It was the first time he'd ever called her. "There's a man here with a truck full of roofing," he said. "No hello. He says you sent him. He says it's paid for." "I did. It is." Elizabeth. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and even through the tightness in his voice, she noticed it. "Call him off." "Daniel, the roof leaks. Emma's drawings." "I said call him off." His voice was level, but there was steel in it. The same steel she'd heard the first night when he'd told her tomorrow afternoon is unacceptable and refused to flinch. "I appreciate what you're trying to do. I do. But I didn't ask you to fix my roof, and I'm not going to have you fixing my roof. It's a leaking roof. I have the money. What is the problem?" "The problem," Daniel said, "is that the second you started paying for things, everything changed. Don't you see that? Right now, you come here, and you're just a person. You sit on a crate, and you talk to my kid, and you're one of us. The minute you start writing checks, you're not a person anymore. You're a rich lady doing charity. And I won't have that. Not for me and not for Emma." "That's absurd. It's a roof. It's never just a roof with people like you." He said it gently, but it landed hard. "You've spent your whole life fixing things with money because it's the tool you've got. I get it. But I've been on the other end of that. When Sarah was sick, people wanted to help, and every single time somebody wrote us a check, something died a little between us and them. Because now we owed them. Now we were the sad case. Now every conversation had this weight to it." He exhaled. "Money doesn't come free, Elizabeth. It always costs something. Usually it costs the exact thing you can't buy back." Elizabeth sat in her penthouse phone pressed to her ear and felt something she hadn't felt in 8 years. She felt corrected. And the strangest part was that it didn't make her angry. It made her ashamed. "I was trying to help," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "I know you were." His tone softened. "And that's exactly why I'm telling you. Not everything broken needs money to fix it. Sometimes the thing you're trying to fix isn't even broken. Sometimes it's fine, and you just don't know how to be around fine without reaching for your wallet." A pause. "Send the man home, Elizabeth. Come by Sunday. I'll teach you how to fix the roof yourself." That way, it's not you buying us something. That's just you and me fixing a roof." She was quiet for a long moment. "I've never fixed a roof?" she said. "I figured. You'll be terrible at it." She could hear the smile come back into his voice. "Bring old clothes, and Elizabeth clothes that don't cost more than my truck. I mean it." She sent the contractor home. And that Sunday, for the first time in her adult life, Elizabeth Carter climbed a ladder onto a roof in a pair of jeans she'd had an assistant buy that morning, because she didn't own a single piece of clothing appropriate for manual labor. And she spent 4 hours learning how to lay shingles under the direction of a man who laughed at her every time she hit her own thumb with the hammer, which was often. "You're holding it like it insulted you," Daniel said, watching her death grip the hammer. "It did insult me, twice." "Loosen up. Let the weight of the hammer do the work. You're trying to muscle it. You muscle everything, that's your whole problem." "I do not muscle everything. You tore a man's contract in half in front of 12 people. I read about it. It's in the article." He grinned. "That's muscling, Elizabeth." She looked at him, startled. "You read an article about me? Emma wanted to know what a CEO does. I looked you up." He hammered a shingle in with 2 easy strokes showing off. "You're kind of a big deal. There's a whole magazine cover. The most feared woman in America." He said it lightly, but he was watching her when he said it. "That's a hell of a thing to have printed under your face. Feared, not admired, not respected, feared." Elizabeth set the hammer down. Below them, Emma was in the lot drawing on the pavement with her chalk, singing to herself. "They're not wrong," she said. "I didn't say they were wrong. I asked how it feels." "It feels like safety," Elizabeth said, and it was the truest thing she'd said out loud in years. "When people are afraid of you, they can't get close enough to hurt you. Fear is a wall. I built the wall on purpose. Every brick." She looked out over the sad little neighborhood, the cracked lots, and the tired storefronts. "You said something the first night, that my bitterness was just fear that got tired of waiting. I haven't stopped thinking about it, because you were right, and no one has ever said a true thing to me before, not once. Everyone tells me what I want to hear because they're afraid of what happens if they don't." "I'm not afraid of you," Daniel said. "I know. That's the problem." She almost laughed. "I don't know what to do with a person who isn't afraid of me. I don't have a strategy for it. I've never needed one." Daniel handed her the hammer back. "Try this strategy," he said. "Just be here. Don't manage it. Don't fix it. Don't buy it. Just be a person on a roof on a Sunday. See how it goes." So she did. And it went well enough that she stayed for dinner, which was spaghetti made on the hot plate, eaten at the folding table, and it was the second best meal she'd had in years, right after the burnt pancakes. Autumn turned to winter, and Elizabeth Carter fell into a rhythm she would never have believed if someone had described it to her a year before. She ran her empire by day. Closed deals, crushed competitors remained in every board meeting and every negotiation. Exactly the woman the magazine had called the most feared in America. And then, once or twice a week, she drove across the city and became someone else entirely, a woman who sat on a crate and got out, argued by a mechanic, and drawn as a princess by a little girl who had at some point Elizabeth couldn't pinpoint, started calling her not the princess, but simply Lizabeth, running the 2 names together the way children do. She was in trouble, and she knew it. She knew it the day she caught herself smiling at her phone in the middle of a meeting, because Daniel had texted her a photo of one of Emma's drawings. She knew it the day she rearranged an entire trip to Singapore, because it would have made her miss Emma's school play in which Emma was playing Tree Number 4 and had exactly 1 line. She knew it most of all the night she lay awake in her penthouse and realized that the empty apartment had started to feel empty in a way it never had before, because now she knew what full felt like, and full was a folding table and a hot plate and a 6-year-old's chalk handprint. Caring about someone meant giving them the power to hurt you. Elizabeth had known that for 8 years. She had built her whole life around never handing that power to anyone again. And she could feel herself handing it over anyway, a piece at a time, to a man who wouldn't take her money, and a child who thought she was a princess, and it terrified her more than any hostile takeover, any market crash, any boardroom full of enemies ever had, because those things she could fight. This she could not fight. This she could only surrender to. And Elizabeth Carter did not know how to surrender. The night it all came to a head started well. It was a few days before Christmas. Daniel had invited her to help decorate the garage. Emma's tradition, apparently stringing lights across the bay and putting a sad little tree in the office window. Elizabeth had come, and she'd been clumsy and useless at the lights, and Emma had bossed her around mercilessly, and it had been perfect. They'd ordered pizza. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch mid-sentence, in the middle of explaining the plot of a cartoon, and Daniel had carried her to bed with that same impossible gentleness. And then he'd come back and sat down across from Elizabeth in the glow of the crooked Christmas lights, and for a while neither of them had said anything at all. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said finally. "And you can tell me it's none of my business." "You've never once worried about whether something was your business." "Fair." He turned his water bottle in his hands. "You come here twice a week. You climb roofs and eat burnt pancakes and let my kid draw crowns on you. You could be anywhere. You could be at a party with senators. You could be on a yacht. Anywhere in the world, and you keep showing up at a garage in the worst part of town." He looked at her. Why? And there it was. The question under all the questions. Elizabeth had known it was coming, and she'd told herself she'd deflect it the way she deflected everything, with something cool and closed. But she was tired. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Tired from 8 years of holding a wall up alone, and something about the crooked lights and the sleeping child, and this man who never wanted anything from her, made the wall feel unbearably heavy. "Because this is the only place I'm real," she said. Daniel didn't say anything. He just waited. "Out there I'm a thing, a brand, the most feared woman in America. People look at me and they see money and power and leverage, and they arrange their faces into whatever they think I want to see, and I can't. I can't tell anymore who's real and who's performing, because everyone's performing. Everyone always has been." Her voice was climbing unsteady, and she couldn't stop it. "My own father performs. My whole life my father looked at me and saw an asset, a Carter, something to be optimized. He taught me that feelings are liabilities you disclose on a balance sheet. He taught me love is leverage. And then I grew up, and I loved someone, and he took everything and left me a note that said I was a good investment, and I realized my father was right. About everything." She was shaking now, just slightly. "So I stopped. I stopped feeling things because feeling things is how they get you. And it worked. For 8 years it worked. And then my stupid car broke down in a storm, and I walked into your garage, and your daughter fell asleep on me, and you made me a burnt pancake and told me I had enough, and I—" She stopped. She'd said too much. She always knew in the moment, the exact instant she'd exposed too much, and she felt it now like a cold hand on the back of her neck. "And you what?" Daniel said quietly. "Nothing." She stood up. "It's late. I should go." "Elizabeth?" "I have an early meeting." "Elizabeth." He did not move to stop her. Daniel never grabbed, never cornered, never used his size or his position, and it was one of the 10,000 small things about him that had gotten past every wall she had. He just said her name gently, and it stopped her more thoroughly than a hand ever could have. "You don't have to run. Nothing here is going to hurt you. That's kind of the whole point of here." She stood by the door with her coat half on, and she felt the tears come, and she hated it. Hated that she couldn't stop it. Hated that after 8 years of perfect control, she was falling apart in a garage over a crooked string of Christmas lights. "That's exactly what scares me," she said, and her voice broke on it. "You, Emma, this. I could lose all of it. I have $14 billion, and I've never been so afraid of losing anything as I am of losing a garage and a folding table and a little girl who thinks I'm a princess. Do you understand what that does to me? I spent 8 years making sure I could never lose anything again, because I made sure I never had anything I couldn't afford to lose. And now," she wiped at her face angrily. Now I have something I can't afford to lose. And I don't know how to live like that. I don't know how to walk around every day knowing that the whole thing could just be taken. The way it was taken before. The way it's always taken. Daniel stood up slowly. He crossed the little office, and he stopped in front of her close, but not too close, giving her room the way he always did. You want to know a secret, he said, about having something you can't afford to lose. She looked at him wet-eyed, waiting. Everybody who has ever loved anything lives exactly like that, he said. Every single one of us. Every parent who ever watched their kid ride a bike for the first time. Every person who ever got married. Everybody who ever had a friend they couldn't stand to bury. We all walk around with something we can't afford to lose, and we all know somewhere in the back of our minds that we might lose it. That's not a flaw in the system, Elizabeth. That is the system. That's what being alive is. The people who don't have anything they can't afford to lose, they're not safe. They're just already dead. They died to protect themselves from dying. He held her gaze. You've been dead for 8 years. You told me so yourself. And now you're scared because you're waking up, and waking up hurts, and it means you can be hurt again. He shrugged, gentle. But dead didn't hurt because dead doesn't feel anything. You get to pick is all. Numb and safe, or alive and scared. Nobody gets alive and safe. That option was never on the table for anybody. Elizabeth stood very still. The tears ran down her face and she didn't wipe them anymore. I don't know if I'm brave enough, she whispered. You tore a contract in half in front of 12 men who could have ended you, Daniel said. You built a company from nothing. You're the most feared woman in America. A small, tired smile. You're plenty brave, Elizabeth. You've just been spending all your bravery on the wrong things. You've been brave enough to fight the whole world. The question is whether you're brave enough to stop fighting it. That's a different kind of brave. That's the harder kind. For a long moment, they stood there in the glow of the crooked Christmas lights, a mechanic and a billionaire, and the whole distance between their worlds seemed to shrink down to the 2 feet of air between them. And Elizabeth, who had planned every minute of every day for 8 years, did something she had not planned. She stepped forward and she kissed him. It was brief. It was clumsy. She was crying, and he was surprised, and it lasted maybe 3 seconds before she pulled back, mortified, her hand flying to her mouth. I'm sorry, she said. I shouldn't have. I don't know why But Daniel wasn't pulling away. He was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something open and stunned and unbearably tender, and for one perfect second, Elizabeth Carter thought that maybe impossibly, this was the moment her whole broken life had been leading up to. And then his face changed. She watched it happen. She watched the openness close, watched something careful and sad slide down over his eyes like a shade being drawn. Watched him take one small step back, not far, but far enough that she felt it like a door shutting. Elizabeth, he said, and the gentleness in his voice was suddenly the worst thing she'd ever heard, because it was the gentleness people use right before they take something away. We can't. The cold hand on the back of her neck spread out across her whole body. We can't. What? She said, though she already knew, she'd already heard it under the words, she'd spent 8 years learning to hear the no before people said it out loud. This. He gestured at the space between them, at the whole impossible thing they'd built over 3 months of Sundays. You and me, we can't. Why not? She heard her own voice go flat and cold, the boardroom voice, the armor sliding back into place out of pure reflex. You just said to be brave. You just told me to pick alive over safe. And I picked. I finally picked. And now you. I know what I said. He looked genuinely pained, and somehow that made it worse. And I meant it. About you. About your life. You should be brave, Elizabeth. You should let people in. You should let yourself be alive again. I meant every word of it. He shook his head slowly. I just can't be the person you do it with. That's all. It can't be me. That doesn't make any sense. "It makes perfect sense," Daniel said. "You just don't want to see it because you're standing too close." He rubbed his face with both hands, and when he lowered them, he looked older, tired, like the last 3 months had cost him something she couldn't see. "You should go home, Elizabeth. It's late. And you were right the first time. You do have an early meeting." She stared at him. The most feared woman in America, undone in a garage, offered up the most vulnerable thing she owned and handed back a no. So gentle, it was almost cruel. "You're doing exactly what he did," she said, and she watched the words hit him. "Adrian, I let you in. I let you all the way in. Further than anyone. And now you're walking away, and you won't even tell me why you're just leaving me standing here." Her voice cracked straight down the middle. "I knew this would happen. I knew it. This is why I built the wall. This is exactly why." "Elizabeth, don't." She grabbed her coat the rest of the way on and yanked the door open, and the cold December air rushed in past the crooked lights. "Don't you say my name like that. Don't you dare." She was halfway to her car when she heard the office door open behind her, and Emma's small, sleep-thick voice float out into the dark. "Daddy, where's Elizabeth going? Is she coming back? And Elizabeth heard Daniel answer, heard the careful, breaking gentleness in it, the sound of a man trying to protect his daughter from a truth he could barely hold himself. "Go back to sleep, baby," he said. "It's late." He didn't say yes. He didn't say she was coming back. Elizabeth got in her car with her hands shaking too hard to hold the wheel, and she sat in the dark lot in front of Brooks Auto Repair, under the string of lights she'd hung crooked that very afternoon, and she cried the way she hadn't let herself cry in 8 years. The ugly, silent, bottomless way. The way you only cry when the exact thing you spent your whole life trying to prevent has happened anyway. She had let someone in. She had done the brave thing, the alive thing, the thing he'd told her to do. And he had looked at the most feared woman in America standing in front of him, with her whole undefended heart in her hands, and he had told her no. She drove home to her empty penthouse. She did not look back at the garage in the mirror because she couldn't stand to see the lights. And somewhere behind her, in the glow of those same crooked lights, Daniel Brooks stood in the doorway of his garage long after her taillights had disappeared. One hand pressed flat against the doorframe, his jaw tight and his eyes wet, whispering to the empty street. The thing he could not say to her face. The real reason, the one that would have changed everything if only he'd been brave enough to say it out loud. But he didn't say it loud enough for anyone to hear. He just said it to the dark, and then he went inside, and he turned off the crooked Christmas lights one by one. She didn't go back for 3 weeks. Elizabeth Carter did what she had always done when something hurt too much to face. She buried it in work. She closed 2 acquisitions before New Year's. She flew to Chicago and back in a single day to personally dismantle a competitor who'd made the mistake of underestimating her. She was by every external measure exactly the woman she'd always been, sharp-cold, untouchable, terrifying. Marcus told a friend that she'd never been more productive. He also told the same friend privately that she'd never seemed more like a machine, and that once walking past her office late at night, he'd seen her sitting perfectly still in the dark. Not working, just staring at her phone, at a photograph of a child's drawing, she couldn't seem to bring herself to delete. She told herself she was fine. She told herself the garage had been a mistake, an aberration, a temporary softness that she'd correctly identified and cut out of her life before it could do real damage. She told herself that Daniel Brooks had done her a favor. He'd reminded her before it went too far why the wall existed in the first place. The problem was Emma. Elizabeth could steel herself against missing Daniel. She'd had practice. She knew how to wall a man off. She'd done it to Adrian and to her father and to everyone else who'd ever gotten close enough to matter. But she had no defenses against a 6-year-old. She'd wake at 3 in the morning thinking about whether Emma had figured out the plot of that cartoon she'd fallen asleep explaining. She'd see a child in the lobby of her building and remember the weight of a small head against her arm. She'd catch herself in the middle of a meeting worth hundreds of millions of dollars, wondering whether anyone had checked under Emma's bed for monsters lately, and whether the little girl thought the princess had abandoned her. And whether this was the thought that gutted her every single time Emma had drawn her a picture that no one would ever give her, it was that thought on a gray afternoon in the third week of January that finally broke her. She told Marcus to clear her schedule. She drove herself across the city. And the whole way there, she rehearsed what she'd say. Cold and controlled something about how she'd come to check on Emma, that this was about the child, that whatever had or hadn't happened between the adults was irrelevant. She had it all planned. She had every word. Then she pulled into the lot and saw the sign in the window. Closed in the middle of a Tuesday, when Brooks Auto Repair was never ever closed, and every rehearsed word evaporated and left nothing but fear. She banged on the office door. No answer. She banged again harder and cupped her hands against the glass, and through it, she could see that the little Christmas tree was still up 3 weeks past Christmas. The crooked lights dark, and something about that. The tree still standing in a closed garage in the third week of January made her stomach drop straight through the floor. She was reaching for her phone to call him when a voice came from behind her. "They're not here." Elizabeth turned. An older man stood at the edge of the lot, a wool cap pulled down over gray hair, leaning on the door of a truck. She recognized Earl's truck, the one Daniel had been rebuilding a transmission for $20 a week. "Where are they?" Her voice came out sharper than she meant it. "Where's Daniel? Where's Emma? Hospital." The old man studied her. "You're the CEO lady, the one Emma calls the princess." "Which hospital is it Emma, is she?" "It's the girl," Earl said, and Elizabeth's whole body went cold. "Been sick a few days. Daniel thought it was just a flu kept her home, but she took a turn 2 nights ago and he ran her into St. Vincent's. Ambulance and everything." He shook his head slowly. "That man. He wouldn't call anybody, wouldn't ask for a thing. I only know because I came by to check on my truck and found the place shut and pried it out of him over the phone." He looked at her, and his weathered face was grim. "It's bad from what I could tell. He didn't say much, but I've known that man 3 years, and I've never heard him sound like that. Not even when—" He stopped. Not even before. Elizabeth was already running for her car. She had never in her life driven the way she drove to St. Vincent's. She ran 2 red lights. She left her car at an angle across 2 spaces in the visitor lot and didn't care. She hit the emergency room doors at a dead run in a suit worth more than the annual salary of every nurse behind the desk, and for once in her life she didn't lead with who she was or what she owned. "Emma Brooks," she said. "A little girl 6 years old. She was brought in 2 nights ago. Please, where is she?" The nurse checked. "Are you family?" And Elizabeth Carter, who had spent 8 years defining herself by the wall between herself and everyone else, said the thing that was true, even though it wasn't legal, even though it wasn't real, even though she had no right to it. "Yes," she said. "I'm family. Please." They pointed her to the pediatric floor. She took the stairs because she couldn't stand to wait for the elevator. 5 flights in heels. And when she came out onto the ward, she saw him immediately. Daniel slumped in a plastic chair outside a room. Elbows on his knees, head in his hands, and even from across the hall, she could see that he was a man who had been awake for 2 days and terrified for every hour of it. He looked up when he heard her heels. And his face when he saw her was so raw, so stripped of every defense that it stopped her cold in the middle of the hallway. "Elizabeth." His voice cracked on the word. "What are you? How did you—" "Earl." She crossed the last few feet between them. "Daniel. What happened? Is she—" She couldn't finish it. She couldn't make herself say the words. "Pneumonia," he said. "It went into her lungs. They caught it. They think they caught it in time, but she's so small and her fever wouldn't—" He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "They've got her on antibiotics and oxygen, and they say the next 12 hours tell the story. That's what they keep saying. The next 12 hours. He laughed, a broken, exhausted sound with no humor in it at all. "I've been sitting here doing the math on 12 hours for 2 days. It's always 12 more hours." Elizabeth did the only thing she knew how to do. She sat down in the plastic chair beside him. "Can I see her?" She's sleeping. Finally. They gave her something. He scrubbed at his face. You don't have to be here, Elizabeth. This isn't you've got a whole life. You've got a company. You don't need to sit in a hospital hallway for a kid who isn't even... Don't. The word came out hard. Don't you dare finish that sentence. Don't you dare tell me she isn't mine to worry about. Her voice was shaking. I have spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself I could walk away from that little girl, Daniel. 3 weeks. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't do a single day of it. So don't tell me what I need to do. I'm exactly where I need to be. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his exhausted face broke open. Why did you stop coming? He asked quietly. I know why I did what I did that night, but you stopped completely. 3 weeks. Emma asked about you every single day. Every day, Elizabeth. Is Elizabeth coming? Did Elizabeth call? And I didn't have an answer for her. You told me no. Elizabeth's voice was barely above a whisper. I handed you everything I had, and you told me no. What was I supposed to do? Keep coming back so you could tell me no again. I have some pride left, Daniel. Not much. You'd taken most of it, but some. That's not... He stopped himself, glanced at the closed door, lowered his voice. That's not what that was. That was never God, Elizabeth. You think I said no because I didn't want you. You said we can't. You looked me in the eye and you said we can't, and you wouldn't tell me why. Because the why is the most selfish thing in the world, Daniel said, and his voice broke completely now, cracking open right there in the hallway. The why is that I've been in love with you since the second night you came back and sat on that crate and let my daughter draw a crown on you. The why is that I lie awake thinking about you. The why is that when you kissed me I wanted to hold on to you and never let go, and it scared me so bad I couldn't breathe. He dragged in a ragged breath. That's the why. And it's exactly why I can't. Elizabeth stared at him. That makes no sense. You love me so you can't be with me. Look where we are. He gestured at the hallway at the closed door at his sleeping, fevered daughter on the other side of it. Look at my life, Elizabeth. Look at it honestly. I've got a garage that barely breaks even. I've got a little girl who's been to the hospital twice this year for things I couldn't afford to prevent. I sold everything I owned when Sarah got sick, and I mean everything, and it still wasn't enough, and I watched her die, knowing that somewhere out there, people with money were getting treatments we couldn't touch. His hands were shaking. And now here's you. You could snap your fingers, and my whole life would be solved. Emma would have the best doctors in the world. I'd never lie awake doing math on 12 hours again. And that is exactly why I can't let myself have you. I don't understand, because I'd never know. It came out of him in a rush, the thing he'd been holding for 3 weeks, for 3 months, maybe longer. Don't you get it? I'd never know if I loved you, or if I loved what you could do for us. Every time you fixed something, every time you made a problem disappear with money, the way you tried to fix my roof, a piece of me would wonder, am I here because I love this woman? Or am I here because being with her means my daughter never has to be sick in a hospital? I can't afford again. His voice dropped ragged and low. You spent your whole life being loved for your money by people who pretended it wasn't about the money. Adrian, your father, everybody. And I swore to myself I would never ever be another one of those people to you, even if it killed me. Even if it meant walking away from the best thing that ever happened to me besides my own kid. Because you deserve one time in your life to be loved by somebody who has nothing to gain from it. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. And the second I let myself have you, I stop being that person. I become just another man who got rich by loving Elizabeth Carter. And I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand to become the thing you're most afraid of. The hallway went completely silent, except for the beeping of machines somewhere and the distant sounds of a hospital at night. Elizabeth Carter sat in a plastic chair beside a man who had just told her that he loved her too much to let her save him. And for the first time in her entire life, She understood exactly what she'd been looking for in every boardroom and every deal and every ruthless year of building her wall. She'd been looking for one person who wanted her more than they wanted anything she could give them. And she'd found him. She'd found him in a garage with grease on his hands and a sick little girl and $20 transmissions, and he was so determined to be that person for her that he was willing to break both their hearts to prove it. "Daniel," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very steady. "Look at me." He did. "You just described the exact opposite of Adrian," she said. "Do you understand that Adrian took everything I had and told me it was love? You're refusing everything I have to prove it's love." She reached over slowly, and she took one of his shaking, grease-stained hands in both of hers, and she held it. "You've been walking around for 3 weeks, thinking you're protecting me from becoming a man who married me for my money. But Daniel, a man who married me for my money, would never in his life turn down my money. That's the whole point. That's the whole thing. The fact that you won't take it is the proof. You're the proof. You've been the proof this entire time, and you couldn't see it because you were standing too close." Daniel stared at their joined hands like he'd never seen anything like them. "I can't ask you to be poor for me," he whispered. "I can't ask you to pretend you're not who you are. You're not asking me anything. I'm telling you." Elizabeth tightened her grip on his hand. "I don't need you to stay poor to prove you love me. I already know you love me. I've known since the roof, if I'm honest. What I need is for you to stop being so busy protecting my heart that you break it instead. Because that's what you did, Daniel. You were so afraid of hurting me the way everyone else did that you did the one thing none of them ever did. You made me feel like the realest thing in my life didn't want me. And that's worse. That's so much worse than any of it." He closed his eyes. A tear slipped down his face, cutting a clean line through 2 days of exhaustion and grief and stubborn, self-destructive love. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to be with someone who could buy and sell my whole world before breakfast and not feel like less." "Then we'll figure it out," Elizabeth said. "Together. The same way you figured out how to raise a little girl alone in the back of a garage. The same way I figured out how to build a company from nothing. Neither of us knew how to do those things either, Daniel. We learned. That's the only thing people ever do. We learn." And then the door opened. A nurse stepped out, and both of them were on their feet before she'd fully cleared the doorway, Daniel's hand still tangled in Elizabeth's. "She's awake," the nurse said, and she was smiling. "And her fever's broken. It broke about 20 minutes ago. It's down almost 2 full degrees. Her lungs are clearing. She's asking for—" The nurse checked, amused. "She's asking for her daddy, and for somebody named Elizabeth. She's very insistent that Elizabeth is supposed to be here." Daniel made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh, and his knees buckled, and Elizabeth caught his arm. "Go," she said. "Go to her. Come with me." He gripped her hand so tightly it hurt. "She asked for you. Come with me." They went in together. Emma was tiny in the big hospital bed, an oxygen line under her nose, and an IV taped to her small arm. Her hair matted and her face pale, but her eyes were open and clear, and when she saw them come through the door, together, holding hands, her cracked lips pulled into the biggest smile her exhausted little face could manage. "You came back," she rasped. "Elizabeth, I knew you would. I told Daddy. I told him you would." Elizabeth Carter, the most feared woman in America, worth $14 billion, who had not cried in 8 years before this winter, and now seemed unable to stop, crossed the room and sank down into the chair beside the bed, and took Emma's small hot hand as carefully as if it were made of glass. "I'm sorry it took me so long, sweetheart," she said. "I'm so sorry. I got a little lost, but I'm here now, and I'm not going to get lost again, I promise." "Pinky promise?" Emma held up one small finger, wobbling with the effort. Elizabeth hooked her own finger around it. "Pinky promise." "That's the most serious kind," Emma informed Daniel gravely. "She can't take it back now. It's a rule." "I know the rule, baby," Daniel said, his voice thick, coming to stand behind Elizabeth's chair. with one hand resting on her shoulder. That's the most serious kind. There's no taking it back. And Elizabeth sitting there with a sick child's hand in hers, and a good man's hand on her shoulder in a hospital room at the darkest hour of the night, understood that she had walked in as one woman and was going to walk out as another, exactly as she had that first stormy night, except that this time she wasn't afraid of it. She'd made a pinky promise, the most serious kind, and she had absolutely no intention of taking it back. They stayed the whole night, the three of them. Emma drifted in and out of sleep, and each time she woke, she checked to make sure they were both still there, and each time they were. And eventually, she stopped checking because some part of her had decided it was safe to believe it. Daniel finally slept too, folded impossibly into the plastic chair, and Elizabeth sat awake between them, keeping watch. Keeping her promise, guarding the two people she'd spent 3 weeks trying to convince herself she could live without. Toward dawn, Daniel stirred and found her still awake, still watching over both of them, and he reached over and covered her hand with his. "You didn't sleep," he said. "No." "Why not?" Elizabeth looked at Emma, breathing easy, now her fever gone, her small chest rising and falling in the gray hospital light. "Because somebody had to be between them and the dark," she said. "Isn't that what you told me? That's all enough is. Somebody between you and the dark so you can sleep." She looked at him, and there was something settled in her face that had never been there before. Something that no boardroom and no wall and no $14 billion had ever been able to give her. "So I stayed up, so you could both sleep. That's my job now, if you'll let me have it." Daniel brought her hand to his lips and held it there, and he didn't say no. He didn't say no ever again. Emma came home from the hospital 4 days later, and Elizabeth was there when she did. She'd rearranged everything. She'd handed off 2 deals to her VPs, canceled a trip to London that had been on the books for 6 months, and told Marcus that unless the building was actually on fire, she was unavailable until further notice. Marcus had written it all down without a word, but later walking out, he'd stopped in the doorway and said something he'd never dared say in 3 years of working for her. "Ms. Carter, whatever's going on with you lately?" He'd hesitated. "You seem happier, that's all. I hope it lasts." And Elizabeth, who would once have fired him for the impertinence, had looked up and said, "So do I, Marcus. So do I." The first weeks after the hospital were the best of Elizabeth's life, and she knew it even while they were happening, which is a rare and precious thing. She learned how to make grilled cheese, the way Emma liked it, cut into triangles, not squares, because squares were wrong. She learned that Daniel snored softly, and that she didn't mind. She learned that a garage apartment with a leaky roof she'd been forbidden to fix could feel more like home than a penthouse with a view of an entire city. She was still Elizabeth Carter. By day still ran the empire, still terrified boardrooms, but she came home now. That was the difference. For the first time in 8 years, there was a home to come to, and 2 people in it who were glad to see her walk through the door. She should have known it couldn't stay that simple. Nothing in Elizabeth's life had ever stayed simple. It was her father who ended it. Richard Carter had built the foundation Elizabeth built her empire on, and he had never stopped believing that everything she'd become belonged in some fundamental way to him. He'd taught her that feelings were liabilities and love was leverage, and he'd watched with cold satisfaction for 8 years as his daughter proved him right, becoming exactly the ruthless, untouchable creature he'd raised her to be. So, when word reached him, and word always reached Richard Carter, that his daughter had been seen at a hospital at a garage with a mechanic and his sick child, he did what he always did with a problem. He investigated it, he priced it, and he moved to eliminate it. Elizabeth found out he knew when she walked into Sunday dinner at his estate, an obligation she'd kept for 34 years, and had thought about skipping, and out of some old worn-down reflex hadn't, and found a folder sitting on her plate where the salad should have been. "Sit down, Elizabeth," her father said from the head of the table. He didn't look up from his wine. "We need to discuss your recent lapse in judgment." She looked at the folder. She didn't touch it. "What is this? Read it." "I asked you what it is." Richard Carter set down his glass. He was 71, silver-haired, immaculate, and he had the coldest eyes Elizabeth had ever seen, which was saying something, because for 8 years, hers had been the coldest eyes anyone else had ever seen, and she'd learned them from him. "It's Daniel Brooks," he said. "Everything about him. His finances, which are a disaster by the way, he's 1 bad month from losing that garage. His late wife's medical debt, which he's still paying. The daughter's condition. His credit. His history." He gestured at it with 2 fingers distastefully, like the folder itself was unclean. "I had it assembled the moment I heard you'd been playing house in a repair shop. I wanted to understand what my daughter thought she was doing, throwing away everything I built for a grease monkey and his sickly child." Elizabeth felt something rise in her chest, hot and immediate, but she'd spent 34 years in this house, learning to keep it off her face. "You had him investigated." "Of course I did. That's what we do, Elizabeth. That's what I taught you to do." He picked his glass back up. "Do you have any idea what this looks like? The most feared woman in America, the head of Carter Global, shacking up with a mechanic who's drowning in debt. The board is nervous. The shareholders will be nervous. It signals weakness. It signals that you've become emotional, compromised. Do you understand how much damage a woman in your position can do to herself by letting the wrong man into her life?" His voice sharpened. "I watched it happen once already. Adrian Wells nearly ruined you. I cleaned up that mess. I am not going to sit here and watch you do it again with someone even more beneath you." At the mention of Adrian, something cold and terrible went still inside Elizabeth. "You cleaned up the Adrian mess," she repeated slowly. "Someone had to." "Tell me what that means." Richard waved a hand. "It means I handled it. He was extracting himself from your life at exactly the wrong moment, threatening to sell your company's difficulties to the press. I made him a better offer to disappear quietly and stay gone. A generous one." He said it like it was nothing, like it was a line item. "You never needed to know the details. You had a company to save." Elizabeth stood very still at the end of her father's table, and 8 years of history rearranged itself in front of her eyes. "You paid him," she said. "You paid Adrian to leave me. I paid Adrian to leave you cleanly, which is not the same thing. He was leaving regardless. I simply made sure he did it in a way that didn't destroy the company." Richard frowned at her expression. "Don't look at me like that. I protected you. I protected the family. You'd have done exactly the same thing in my position." "He left me a note." Elizabeth's voice had gone strange, flat, and far away. "On the kitchen counter. It said I was a good investment while it lasted. 6 words. I have read that note in my head every single day for 8 years. It's the reason I built everything. The wall. The company. The whole life. Every ruthless thing I've ever done I did because a man I loved told me I was nothing but money to him." She looked at her father. "And you're telling me you paid him. You put money in his hand and sent him away, and let me believe he did it because that's who he was. You let me spend 8 years thinking love was a lie, and it was you. It was you the whole time. I saved your company. You broke my heart." It came out of her in a way nothing ever came out of Elizabeth Carter, loud and raw and shaking, and a wine glass rattled. "You had a chance to save both. You could have told him no. You could have exposed him. You could have come to me, and instead, you paid the man I loved to break me. And then you spent 8 years watching me turn into you and calling it success." "Sit down, Elizabeth." "No," I said, "sit down. You are making a scene and you are proving my exact point. This is what emotion does. This is the mechanic's influence. 6 months ago, you'd never have raised your voice in this house." "6 months ago, I was dead," Elizabeth said. "You just didn't notice because you liked me better that way." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard Carter set his glass down very carefully. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped all its warmth, all its performance of paternal concern. And what was left underneath was pure steel, the steel Elizabeth had inherited and honed and used to build an empire turned now against her. "Let me be very clear with you," he said, "because you're not thinking clearly, so I'll think clearly for you. You are going to end this. You're going to stop seeing the mechanic and his child. You're going to issue whatever quiet correction is necessary to reassure the board, and you're going to remember who you are and what you were built for." He tapped the folder. "And if you don't, if you insist on humiliating this family for the sake of a man who fixes cars, then I will make things difficult. I still hold a great deal of influence over Carter Global. More than you'd like. I sit on the board. I have relationships with your major shareholders that predate your existence. I could make your position very, very uncomfortable, Elizabeth. I don't want to, but I will." Elizabeth looked at her father for a long moment, and she started to laugh. It wasn't hysterical. It wasn't a breakdown. It was low and genuine and almost gentle, and it frightened Richard Carter more than any amount of shouting could have, because he'd never heard it before. "You just threatened me," she said. "You just sat at your dinner table and threatened to destroy the company I built to force me to give up the only real thing in my life." She shook her head wonderingly. "Daniel refused to let me pay for a roof. Do you understand that a man with nothing drowning in debt, and he wouldn't let me buy him a roof because he was afraid it would put a price on something that was supposed to be free? And you—" She gestured at the whole table, the estate, the folder, all of it. "You have everything, and you'll use every dollar of it as a weapon against your own daughter to get what you want. You want to talk about who's beneath whom, father? He's worth more than every man in this family. He proved it by refusing everything you'd kill to keep. You're being sentimental. I'm being clear." She picked up the folder finally, and she didn't open it. She held it up. "You investigated Daniel to find something to use against him. His debt, his wife's medical bills, his daughter's illness. You took the three worst things that ever happened to a good man, and you put them in a folder to use as a weapon." She set it back down. "You know what I see when I read this? I see a man who sold everything he owned to try to save his wife and couldn't. I see a man who's still paying her medical debt years later because he refuses to walk away from a promise even to the dead. I see a man raising a little girl alone in the back of a garage and doing it so well that she goes to bed every night feeling safe. That's not a liability, father. That's the most valuable thing I've ever found. And you looked right at it and saw a credit score." Richard's jaw tightened. "So that's your answer? You'll throw away everything I built? Everything you built? For him? I'm not throwing away the company. The company is mine. I saved it alone. It turns out since the man I thought abandoned me was actually paid to leave by my own father." Her voice was steady now, ice-cold, the boardroom voice, but turned to a purpose it had never served before. "And you're right that you have influence with the board. You have relationships with the shareholders. So let me be very clear with you, since we're being clear." She leaned forward, both hands flat on the table. "If you move against me, if you use 1 ounce of that influence to threaten my position because of who I choose to love, I will spend every dollar and every hour I have making sure it's the last move you ever make in that boardroom. I know where the bodies are buried, father. You taught me where to dig. I've been the most feared woman in America for 8 years, and I learned it all from you, and I promise you I am better at it than you are now. I'm younger, I'm hungrier, and for the first time in my life, I have something worth fighting for that isn't fear." She straightened up. "So think very carefully about whether you want to make this a war, because I'll win it. And I'll do it without losing a single night's sleep, because unlike you, I'll have something to come home to when it's over." For a long moment, father and daughter stared at each other across the length of the table. Two versions of the same cold steel, and for the first time in Elizabeth's life, her father looked away first. "Get out of my house," Richard Carter said quietly. "Gladly." Elizabeth picked up her coat. At the door she stopped and looked back at him, and some of the ice went out of her voice, replaced by something older and sadder. "You spent my whole life protecting me from being hurt. That's the story you tell yourself, isn't it? That everything you did to protect me. The wall you taught me to build. The feelings you taught me to bury. The man you paid to disappear." She shook her head slowly. "But you were never protecting me from the thing that was hurting me. Because the thing that was hurting me the most all along was you. You just made sure I could never see it, because you taught me to call it love. She left him alone at the head of his long table, and she drove back across the city to a garage with a leaky roof, and she did not cry, because for the first time, she wasn't leaving something behind. She was going toward something. She told Daniel everything that night after Emma was asleep. All of it, the folder, the investigation, the threat, and the thing underneath all of it, the truth about Adrian, that had been sitting buried under 8 years of her life like a landmine. Daniel listened without interrupting. He was good at that. It was one of the 10,000 things about him. And when she finished, he was quiet for a while, turning his water bottle in his hands, the way he did when he was thinking hard about something. He paid Adrian to leave you, he said finally, and then let you blame yourself for it. Yes? For 8 years. Yes. Daniel set the bottles down. Elizabeth, I need you to hear me say something, and I need you to actually hear it, because I know you and I know your first instinct is going to be to armor up and pretend it doesn't matter. He reached over and took her hand. None of that was ever about you. Not Adrian, not your father, none of it. You were a kid handed to a man who couldn't love anything he couldn't put a price on, and you grew up thinking that was normal. You grew up thinking love was supposed to feel like a transaction, like a test you could fail, like something that could be bought and sold, because that's the only love you ever saw. That's not a flaw in you. That's a wound somebody put in you before you were old enough to stop them. He squeezed her hand. You spent 8 years thinking you were unlovable because a man was paid to leave you, and the man who paid him was the one person who was supposed to make you feel like you were worth staying for. You were never the problem, Elizabeth. You were the kid. You were always just the kid. And Elizabeth Carter, who had faced down her father without shedding a tear, put her face in her hands and wept finally for the little girl at the long cold table who had learned to call it love. Daniel held her. He didn't try to fix it. He'd told her once that not everything broken needs money to fix it, and he understood better than anyone she'd ever met that some broken things don't need fixing at all. They just need someone to sit with them in the dark until the worst of it passes. So he sat with her. He held her while she cried out 8 years, 34 years, a whole lifetime of a wound she'd been taught to call by the wrong name. And when it was over, when she was hollowed out and quiet against his chest, he spoke very softly into her hair. You know what the difference is between your father and me, he said. He spent your whole life telling you that you had to earn being loved, that you had to be strong enough, cold enough, successful enough, feared enough. That love was something you qualified for. He tilted her chin up so she was looking at him. I don't care if you never close another deal. I don't care if you lose the whole company tomorrow. I don't care if you're strong, or if you fall apart in my arms every night for the rest of your life. I'm not here for Elizabeth Carter, CEO. I never was. I'm here for the woman who let my daughter draw a crown on her and stayed up all night in a hospital so I could sleep. You don't have to earn a single thing with me. You already have all of it. You had it the second you walked into my garage out of the rain. Elizabeth looked at him wet-eyed and undone, and she asked the question she'd been afraid to ask since the first night, the question that was the title of her whole life. Why? She whispered. Why would you choose me? You could love someone simple, someone without a father like mine, without a wall like mine, without 8 years of damage and a folder full of enemies. Why won't you? Why would you choose all of this? Why would you choose me? And Daniel Brooks' mechanic's single father, the man who had refused her a roof and turned down her money and broken both their hearts, trying to prove he loved her. For nothing she could give him. Smiled the tired, gentle smile she'd fallen in love with on a rooftop in the fall. Because I never chose Elizabeth Carter, he said. I chose the woman who's scared she's not worth choosing. That's who I want. Not in spite of the wall, because of what's behind it. I've seen behind it, Elizabeth. I've been back there, and there's a person back there worth every single thing I've got. You just never had anybody willing to climb over and find her. He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. So that's my answer. That's why I'll choose you. Every day. Even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones. They sat together in the small apartment over the garage in the quiet in the dark, and Elizabeth understood that she'd spent her entire life believing love was a thing you won or lost, earned or failed, bought or were bought by, and that it had taken a man with grease-stained hands and nothing to gain to show her that real love wasn't any of those things. Real love was just someone who climbed the wall, found the person behind it, and decided to stay. Her father called twice over the following weeks. She didn't answer. On the third call she did, and she listened to him lay out in his cold and measured way the case for reconciliation, the family, the company, the reputation, all the things he'd built his life on and tried to build hers on too. And when he was done, she said only one thing. "The door's open, Dad. It usually is." It was Daniel's line, the one he'd said to her that first morning, and using it felt like planting a flag on new ground. When you're ready to meet Emma, not investigate her, not price her, just meet her, you call me. Until then, I've got a family to get home to. And she hung up, and she went home to them. Richard Carter did not move against her. Perhaps he'd believed her threat. Perhaps in some corner of him too small and too calcified to admit it. Her words at the dinner table had actually landed. Elizabeth never knew for certain, and she found to her own surprise that she didn't need to. She'd spent 34 years needing her father's approval, and 8 years pretending she didn't. Now she simply stopped needing it at all, and the absence of that need was the lightest she'd ever felt. Emma got stronger. The pneumonia became a scary story she told her friends with relish, embellishing the details, adding a dramatic ambulance chase that had not occurred. She started calling Elizabeth Lizabeth, less, and something else more, tentatively at first testing it. And the first time she said it, Elizabeth had to leave the room so the child wouldn't see her cry. The garage got busier. Word had gotten around the neighborhood that Daniel Brooks was honest and fair, and honesty and fairness, it turned out, were good for business, even in a bad part of town. Earl's wife lived to see the spring, and Earl drove his rebuilt transmission 40 miles a day right up until the end. And when the end came, Daniel closed the garage for the funeral, and Elizabeth stood beside him, in a plain black coat, holding Emma's hand, one more member of the strange growing family of people who'd been touched by a mechanic who fixed things for $20 a week. And late one night in the spring, lying awake in the apartment over the garage, listening to Daniel breathe and Emma murmur in her sleep down the hall. Elizabeth Carter, the most feared woman in America, worth $14 billion, who had once believed with her whole heart that love was a weakness and trust was a mistake, realized that she was for the first time she could remember completely and simply happy. Not because she'd won anything, not because she'd closed a deal or crushed a rival or protected herself behind a higher wall, but because she'd finally, after a whole lifetime of being taught otherwise, let someone in and the roof hadn't caved and the walls hadn't been necessary. And the person she'd been so afraid to be, the soft one, the one who reached for things, the one her father had tried to kill, and Adrian had tried to bury, and she herself had spent 8 years pretending was gone, that person had been alive the whole time. Just waiting behind the wall. Just waiting for someone willing to climb it. The spring turned into summer, and the summer was the season Daniel Brooks finally stopped being afraid. It wasn't a single moment. It was 100 small ones, stacked up over months, until one day he looked around and realized the fear that had lived in his chest since Sarah died. The fear of loving something he could lose. The fear of not being enough. The fear that had made him break both their hearts in a garage the winter before had quietly packed up and left without telling him. He noticed its absence, the way you notice a toothache is gone, not with a bang, but with a strange disbelieving lightness, a wondering whether it had ever really been there at all. He noticed it specifically on a Saturday morning in June, watching Elizabeth teach Emma to make pancakes. They were objectively terrible pancakes. Elizabeth had many gifts, but cooking was not among them, and Emma was 6, which meant that between the two of them, they'd managed to get batter on the ceiling on the dog next door, and somehow inside the toaster, which had no business being anywhere near pancakes. But they were laughing. Elizabeth was laughing the real laugh, the one Daniel had spent months coaxing out of her. A little at a time. The one her father had tried to bury and Adrian had tried to buy, and she'd spent 8 years believing was gone for good, and Emma was standing on a chair with flour in her hair, calling herself the Pancake Queen. And Daniel stood in the doorway of the little apartment over the garage and understood that this was it. This was the thing. This was the enough he'd been telling Emma about her whole life. The enough he'd believed in on faith without ever quite having it himself. And here it was standing in his kitchen covered in flour. And it had come to him not through money or luck or anything he'd earned, but through a broken-down car on a stormy night and a woman brave enough to walk into his garage out of the rain. "You're staring," Elizabeth said without turning around. She always knew when he was looking at her now. She'd stopped flinching at being seen. "I am." "Is something wrong?" "No," Daniel said. "For once, absolutely nothing is wrong." He proposed to her 3 weeks later, and he did it exactly the way a man like Daniel Brooks would do it, which is to say, without a ring, worth more than his truck, without a rented yacht or a skywriter, or any of the things a man might do to impress the most feared woman in America. He did it on the roof they'd fixed together the fall before at sunset, with Emma hiding badly behind a chimney because she'd been made a co-conspirator and could not at 6 be trusted to hide well. "I don't have much to offer you," he said, kneeling on the shingles they'd laid with their own hands. "You know that better than anybody. I've got a garage that finally breaks even an apartment with a roof that only leaks a little now, a kid who thinks you hung the moon in me. That's the whole list. That's everything I've got." Elizabeth looked at him and at the crooked skyline behind him, and at the small girl failing spectacularly to stay hidden behind the chimney, and she thought about the $14 billion and the empire and the penthouse and everything she'd spent her life accumulating to fill a hole that this exact list, this whole entire list, had filled completely. "Daniel," she said, "that list is worth more than everything I own. It took me 34 years to figure that out. Ask me the question," he asked. She said yes before he finished, and Emma came flying out from behind the chimney shouting, "She said yes, I saw it. I was here for it." And the three of them sat on the roof they'd built together and watched the sun go down over a neighborhood the world had written off. And it was without competition, the best evening of all 3 of their lives. They were married in the fall, 1 year almost to the day, from the stormy night Elizabeth's car had died on Riverside Drive. It was not the wedding the magazines expected. When word got out that Elizabeth Carter, Iron Elizabeth, the most feared woman in America, was marrying an auto mechanic from the worst part of the city, the business press lost its collective mind. There were think pieces about what it meant for Carter Global. There were breathless speculations about prenuptial agreements and gold digging, and whether the great Elizabeth Carter had finally at last gone soft. One particularly vicious columnist wrote a piece titled, "The $14 billion Mistake," predicting that Daniel Brooks would clean her out within 5 years. Elizabeth read it once, laughed, and framed it. She hung it in the garage office next to Emma's drawings, right where she could see it every day. "Why would you keep that?" Daniel asked her the first time he saw it on the wall. "Because he's got it exactly backwards," Elizabeth said. "He thinks you married me for the $14 billion. And you're the one man on earth who'd never touch a cent of it. You made me put it in a trust for Emma before you'd even discuss marrying me. Do you remember what you said?" Daniel almost smiled. "I said I wasn't going to lie awake next to a fortune I didn't earn. You said you wanted to keep fixing cars, that you didn't want my money to make your work optional, because a man's work isn't supposed to be optional, it's supposed to mean something." She looked at the framed article. "That columnist will never understand that in 100 years. He thinks the story is a rich woman who got fooled. He can't even imagine the real story. So I keep it up there to remind me how lucky I am to have the one thing that man can't conceive of." She leaned into Daniel's side. "A person who wanted me, and not one single thing I could give him." The wedding was small. They held it in the lot outside Brooks Auto Repair of all places. Emma's idea, and once she'd said it out loud, neither of them could imagine it anywhere else. They strung the crooked Christmas lights back up across the bay, the same ones Elizabeth had hung so badly the winter before. The neighborhood came. Earl's widow came in her good dress. The families whose cars Daniel had fixed for fair prices came, and the man from the corner store, and Emma's whole first-grade class, and Marcus, who cried openly and didn't care who saw. Elizabeth's father did not come. She'd sent him an invitation. She hadn't expected him to accept, and he hadn't, and she'd made her peace with that. In the long, slow way, you make peace with a wound that will never fully close, but stops bleeding eventually, if you let it. She stood in a simple white dress in a garage parking lot, surrounded by people who had almost nothing, and had come anyway, and she did not let the empty chair with her father's name on it ruin the best day of her life. But then, halfway through the ceremony, a car pulled up to the edge of the lot. It was a town car, black, expensive, wildly out of place among the pickup trucks and the old sedans. It stopped at the far edge, and for a long moment, nothing happened, and Elizabeth's heart did something complicated in her chest. The door opened, and Richard Carter got out. He didn't come all the way in. He stood at the edge of the lot in a suit that cost more than the wedding, looking deeply, profoundly out of his element, an old man who had built a life on the belief that this, a garage, a mechanic, crooked lights, ordinary people, was beneath him. He looked like he wasn't sure why he'd come. He looked like he might turn around and leave. And then a small figure detached itself from the crowd and marched straight up to him. Emma. In her flower girl dress with flowers in her hair, planted herself in front of the most powerful man Elizabeth had ever known and put her hands on her hips. "Are you Elizabeth's daddy?" she demanded. Richard Carter looked down at the child. "I am. You're late," Emma informed him. "The wedding already started. But that's okay, you can still come. There's cake." She considered him. "Are you going to be mean? Because if you're going to be mean, you have to leave. Daddy says nobody who's going to be mean gets to stay. That's the rule." The whole lot had gone quiet. Elizabeth started to move toward them, but Daniel put a hand on her arm. "Wait," his eyes said. "Let it happen." Richard Carter looked at this small girl, this sickly child as he'd called her, this liability, this thing he'd put in a folder, and something in the old man's face, some ancient frozen thing that had been frozen since before Elizabeth was born, cracked. "No," he said, and his voice was rough. "No, I'm not going to be mean. Pinky promise." Emma held up her finger. Richard Carter, Chairman, Billionaire. The coldest man in America looked at the small finger held up to him, and after a long moment, he hooked his own around it. "Pinky promise," he said. "That's the most serious kind," Emma told him gravely. "You can't take it back now." "No," Richard said. "I don't suppose I can." Emma took his hand. Just took it the way she'd taken Elizabeth's the first night, the way children do. With no idea that the hand belonged to a man who could buy and sell everyone in that parking lot. And she towed him into the wedding, and she sat him down in the chair with his name on it, and she said, "This is my grandpa, everybody. He's going to be nice now, he pinky promised." Elizabeth met her father's eyes across the lot. Neither of them said anything. There was too much to say, and no way to say it in the middle of a wedding, and maybe that was for the best, because some things don't get healed with words. They get healed with a pinky promise, and a slice of cake, and a child too young to know that some people are supposed to be beyond forgiving. Richard Carter stayed for the whole ceremony. He watched his daughter marry a mechanic in a garage parking lot under a string of crooked lights, and when Elizabeth said her vows, the old man looked away, and no one could quite see his face. The vows were the part everyone remembered afterward. Elizabeth went first. She'd written them and rewritten them a dozen times, and in the end, she'd thrown out every draft and just spoken from the wound that had finally, after a whole life, begun to close. "I spent 34 years believing that love was a transaction," she said, holding both of Daniel's hands. "My father taught me that. He taught me you had to earn it, that you qualified for it, that it was leverage and weakness and a mistake you only made once. And I believed him. I believed him so completely that I built a wall around my whole heart. And I spent 8 years standing behind it, telling myself I was safe, telling myself I was strong, telling myself I didn't need anyone." Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. "And then my car broke down in a storm. And I walked into a garage. And a man made me a burnt pancake and told me I had enough, and his daughter fell asleep on me like the world was a safe place, And slowly, without my permission, without my strategy, without a single thing I could control, you two climbed my wall. She squeezed his hands. You didn't buy your way in. You couldn't have. Everyone else always tried to buy their way in, and I always saw them coming. But you had nothing to offer me except yourself. And that was the one thing I'd never learned to defend against. The one thing money can't fake. She was crying now openly, the most feared woman in America, weeping in a parking lot and not caring who saw. You asked me once why I wouldn't run from you. And the answer is that you were the first place I'd ever been where nothing was expected of me, where I could just be a person, where I didn't have to be strong or cold or feared or Iron Elizabeth or a Carter or anything at all, except a woman who laughed at your daughter's bad jokes and loved you both more than I ever thought I could love anything. She took a breath. I built an empire because I thought I had to be strong alone. You showed me that real strength was letting myself have someone worth coming home to. So that's my vow. I'll come home. Every day. Even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones. I'll come home to you both for the rest of my life, and I'll never stop being grateful that a storm was mean enough to break my car in front of the right garage. Then it was Daniel's turn. He wasn't a man of many words, and everyone who knew him knew it. So the lot went very quiet to hear what the mechanic would say to the billionaire he was marrying. When Sarah died, he began, and his voice caught, and he had to start again. When Sarah died, I made her 2 promises. I promised I'd take care of Emma, and I promised I wouldn't let losing her turn me bitter. He looked at Elizabeth. I kept the first one easy. Loving Emma was never hard, but the second one I struggled with. Because it's easy to say you won't get bitter, and it's another thing to lie awake doing math on 12 hours in a hospital hallway and not let it turn your heart to stone. He shook his head. For years I thought keeping that promise just meant not being angry, grinning through it, fixing everybody's cars and making pancakes and pretending the hole wasn't there. But that's not bitter. That's just numb with a smile on it. He took a breath. And then you walked into my garage, and I found out what the promise actually meant. It didn't mean not being sad about what I lost. It meant staying open enough to let something new in. It meant being brave enough to love again. Even though I knew better than anybody, I knew exactly how much it costs when you lose it. His voice broke. You think I saved you, Elizabeth. You stand up here and you thank the storm and you thank me for climbing your wall. But you've got it backwards. You're the one who saved me. I was the one hiding behind a wall. I was the one who decided it was safer to love nothing new ever again. And you're the one who was brave enough for both of us. You kissed me in a garage with your whole heart in your hands, and I got scared and I ran and you came and found me in a hospital anyway, and you told me to stop protecting your heart so hard that I broke it. He wiped his face. So here's my vow. I already told you the answer to your question, the one you were always too scared to ask out loud. Why would I choose you? And the answer's the same today as it was that night, and it'll be the same when we're old. I never fell in love with Elizabeth Carter, the CEO. I never once wanted the $14 billion, or the empire, or any of it. I fell in love with the woman who let my daughter draw a crown on her. I fell in love with the woman who stayed up all night in a hospital so I could sleep. I fell in love with the person behind the wall, the soft one, the scared one, the one who reached for things and got her hand slapped and learned to stop reaching. I fell in love with her. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure she never has to stop reaching again. There wasn't a dry eye in the parking lot. Even Richard Carter, at the edge of it all in his too expensive suit, was looking very hard at the ground. They were pronounced husband and wife under the crooked lights, and Emma threw an entire fistful of flower petals directly into Daniel's face at exactly the wrong moment, and everyone laughed. And the laughter was the kind you only get at the weddings that are actually about something. The ones where the whole crowd knows they're watching 2 people who genuinely saved each other's lives. They danced in the parking lot. Daniel danced with Elizabeth, And then Elizabeth danced with Emma, standing on her feet the way Daniel had taught her. And then, and no one who was there ever forgot this, Emma marched over to her brand new grandfather, held out both hands, and made Richard Carter dance with her in an auto shop parking lot in the worst part of town. And the old man, stiff and out of place, and 71 years old, danced with his granddaughter under the crooked lights, and something in him that had been frozen for the better part of a century finally began to thaw. He and Elizabeth spoke near the end of the night off to the side where no one could hear. "I owe you an apology," Richard said. It clearly cost him everything to say it. "For Adrian, for the folder, for all of it, for the way I raised you." He looked out at the party at Daniel spinning Emma in circles at the crooked lights. "I taught you that love was leverage because it was the only thing I understood. My father taught it to me the same way. I thought I was giving you armor. I didn't understand I was giving you a cage." His jaw worked. "I don't know how to fix 34 years, Elizabeth. I don't think it can be fixed. But I'd like to try to be different, going forward, if you'll let me, if she'll let me." He nodded toward Emma. "That child Pinky promised me into a wedding. I've negotiated with heads of state. I've never been outmaneuvered so completely in my life." Elizabeth looked at her father, and she felt 8 years of anger and 34 years of hurt, and underneath all of it, buried so deep, she'd forgotten it was there. The small, stubborn love of a little girl at a long, cold table who had only ever wanted her father to see her. "You can't fix the past," she said. "But you can show up for the future. That's all anybody can do." She almost smiled. "Daniel taught me that. He says you don't build enough, you just show up. Every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." She looked at him. "So show up, Dad. Not for the company, not for the family name. For her." She nodded at Emma. "Be the grandfather you never learned how to be a father. Start there. Start where it's easy. She makes everything easy. It's her superpower." Richard Carter looked at his granddaughter spinning under the lights, and for the first time in Elizabeth's entire life, she watched her father's cold eyes go soft. "She reminds me of you," he said quietly, "before I ruined it. Before I taught you to be afraid." He swallowed. "I'd like to know her before I teach her anything at all. Maybe that's the trick. Maybe I just don't teach her anything. Maybe I just love her and keep my ruined philosophy to myself." "Now you're getting it," Elizabeth said. And Richard Carter, who had come to a garage parking lot expecting to disapprove, and had instead been pinky promised into a dance and an apology, and the beginning of something like redemption, put his arm stiffly awkwardly around his daughter's shoulders, and the two of them watched the family she'd built out of nothing but a broken-down car and the courage to walk into a garage out of the rain. The years went on the way years do. The garage thrived. Daniel never took $1 of Elizabeth's money for it, and he never needed to, because it turned out that a reputation for honesty in a dishonest world is worth more than any investment. He hired 2 more mechanics from the neighborhood kids who'd have had nowhere else to go, and taught them the trade, and taught them without ever saying it out loud, the thing that mattered more than the trade. That you fix things because people need them. Fixed. That not everything broken needs money, that you show up. Elizabeth kept running Carter Global, and she was still formidable, still sharp, still a woman who could silence a boardroom. But the coldness was gone, and something better had grown in its place, a kind of steadiness, a strength that didn't come from being untouchable, but from having something worth protecting. Her employees stopped being afraid of her and started being loyal to her, which she learned to her surprise was a far more powerful thing to command. She never fired anyone for saying too many words again. She'd learned the value of the small stuff. Anybody can behave when it counts. It's the 2 in the morning, nobody's watching stuff that tells you who somebody actually is. Emma grew up. She grew up in a home with 2 parents and a grandfather who spoiled her rotten and kept his ruined philosophy entirely to himself, exactly as promised. She grew up knowing the way Daniel had always wanted her to know, that somebody would burn the whole world down for her. And when she was older, much older, and someone asked her about her family, about the famous CEO mother and the mechanic father, about how two people from such impossibly different worlds had ever found each other. She always told the story the same way. "My mom's car broke down in a storm," she'd say, "and she walked into my dad's garage instead of waiting for someone to rescue her. That's the whole thing. That's the whole story. She was brave enough to walk in out of the rain. Everything else came from that." And late at night, sometimes years and years later, Elizabeth would lie awake beside her sleeping husband, in a home that had started as an apartment over a garage and grown into something bigger. And she would think about the woman she'd been on that stormy night. Iron Elizabeth, the most feared woman in America, worth $14 billion and dead inside, driving home to an empty penthouse where no one waited. She'd think about how close she'd come to never getting out of the car. How easy it would have been to wait for another driver, another rescue, another transaction. How the whole rest of her life had hung on a single choice to sit in the dark and be saved, or to get out and walk toward the light herself. She'd gotten out of the car. That was all. That was everything. And every single day of the life that followed, she was grateful she had. Grateful for the storm and the broken engine and the crooked lights. Grateful for a man who wouldn't take her money and a little girl who thought she was a princess. Grateful most of all that she'd learned before it was too late. The truth her father had spent a lifetime hiding from her, and Daniel had spent a season teaching her without ever charging a cent. Love was never a transaction. It was never something you earned or qualified for, or won or lost. It was never leverage, and it was never a weakness, and it was never a mistake. Love was just this two people who had every reason to protect themselves, choosing instead to climb each other's walls, and deciding every day, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones, to stay. Elizabeth Carter had spent 34 years building an empire to prove she needed no one. And in the end, the strongest thing she ever did, the bravest and the best and the truest thing, was walk out of the rain into a broken-down garage and let herself be found. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If this story touched your heart or inspired you in any way, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Your support helps us create more emotional stories filled with hope, family, second chances, and unforgettable life lessons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. See you in the next video.